Welcome everybody, and thanks for coming to this launch of Resist Stories of Uprising. This book arrived at Becca's flat this morning at about 8:30 a.m, hot off the press, or cold off the press because we've been travelling overnight. You're here at the very, very first event where we actually have this book. We're very, very proud of it. This is actually part two of a series of books where Comma Press, my name's Rob Hayes, sorry, I'm the editor of this book, founder of Comma Press. It's part two of a series of books where we pair writers with historians and also activists to kind of reimagine moments of British protest history. It's very important to us that it was British because the British are not always known for their revolutionary kind of ire, their kind of desire for revolt. But I think that's part of the myth and the narrative about Britain, which is perpetuated for very specific reasons. It has an amazing, immense history of protest, and in putting these two books together, I brought visual aids. Part one, which is called Protest, and part two, which is called Resist. We've covered 40 protests in total. Each book looks at 20 different protests, and the new book covers from 2,000 years, so from Boudicca to Grenfell Tower. The idea is we pair the writers with a historian or an activist in the case of more recent protests, and we try to encourage them to produce a story which is fiction, ostensibly fiction, and fiction in terms of the characters in the foreground, but as historically accurate as possible. The historians or the activists kind of consult on them, they check the stories for historical inaccuracies, and they also write an afterword, which allows the general reader to kind of gen up on the context of these protests, what was the environment in which they grew up. A key kind of idea behind this series is to kind of flip the version of history, the simplified version of history, which we're often fed. It's sometimes referred to as the Thomas Carlyle's great man theory. Thomas Carlyle was this 19th century historian who came up with this famous line: "History is but the biography of great men." Essentially saying that history is nothing but the famous people's biographies, and everybody else, all of us, we're just extras, we're just kind of background scenery, supporting cast or whatever. And the idea with these books is to go beyond that version of history and to tell kind of real history, people's history, and not just the kind of the shorthand version of, as I say, great men. I wanted to start with a quote from one of my favourite historians, a guy called Howard Zinn, who in a famous lecture shortly after he was arrested at a demo, an anti-Vietnam War demo. He was supposed to be appearing in court, and instead he gave this lecture, and he was arrested on his way out of the lecture hall. In this lecture, which is called "The Problem is Civil Obedience," he said, and this is 1970s, Nixon and Brezhnev have more in common with one another than Nixon has with us. J. Edgar Hoover has more in common with the head of the Soviet secret police than he has with us. That's why we are always surprised when they get together. They smile, they shake hands, they smoke cigars. They really like one another, no matter what they say. This was at the height of the Cold War, when the president of the US and the president of the Soviet Union were supposed to be, at loggerheads and completely, polar opposites to each other. Howard Zinn was making this point that they have more in common with each other than they do with us. Now we're in a situation where the pretense of our leaders representing us has been dropped. Trump picks up a phone call and has a conversation with Putin, or has a conversation with Erdogan, or has a conversation with Kim Jong-un, and he makes his decisions on the basis of his respect for other great men, or his respect for other strong men. The kind of principles of democracy are kind of cast aside, and this pretense that these leaders shouldn't get on has been dropped. So the idea with this book is to sort of cast those figures aside and look at real people and real history and people's history. And one of the kind of sad aspects of this book was, as we were putting it together, we essentially gave the writers a long list of, I think there's up to 100 or 80 or something, list of British protests, and they just picked them. And I noticed a pattern this time around with the second book, that a lot of them were looking at protests against the far right, the rise of the far right. And I thought it's obviously an incredibly topical issue now. We've had, since 2016, you've had a rise in racist attacks, you've had a rise in kind of far right rhetoric, xenophobia, attacks on bookshops, all kinds of attempts to kind of other the British public, or elements of the British public, other people amongst ourselves, to kind of set them aside and say they are not us. And today's today's event, I thought it would be a good idea, although it's a very depressing subject, to pick out 3 stories which really represent this fear. We have 3 fantastic readers today, and I'll introduce them before we hear from them. We have Steve Chambers, who is an award-winning dramatist and writer. His novel Gladio, we can neither confirm nor deny, was the Newcastle Journal Culture Award. His feature film Hold Back the Night won the Prix de Public Forum at Cannes, and he's written a great deal for radio. We also have Karline Smith, who is a writer that Comma has published, and I've published for something like 20 years, I'm scared to say. But I've never met her before, so it's amazing to have her here. She's the author of 3 novels, Moss Side Massive, Full Crew, and Goosebumps and Butterflies and Fairy Tales. I've commissioned her and published short stories with her, the City Life book of Manchester short stories, and MO, a book of crime stories we published many years ago. And we're also delighted to have Irfan Master, who is an award-winning author of 2 novels for young adults, A Beautiful Lie, which was shortlisted for the Waterstones Children's Book Prize, and Out of Heart, which was long listed for the Philip Carnegie Medal for Children's Literature. He's also the author of plays, poetry, and short stories. The 3 of them have written about specific moments in British history, which relate, as I say, to the kind of these flare-ups of the far right. Steve has written about Cable Street, which he'll talk about, which was this eruption of black shirts in the East End, and a fight to stop them from marching through the East End of London in 1936, and a very famous moment in British history that is never really talked about as much as it should be. Karline has written a story about the Notting Hill Riots, which again was a defence against racist teddy boys who were kind of supported by the British fascists in 1958, and was also the starting point of what became the Notting Hill Carnival. And Irfan has written a story about the Southal Riot, which was a riot caused by the National Front in 1979, wanting to have a meeting, a public meeting in the middle of one of Britain's and London's biggest Asian communities. Again, just another kind of troublemaking, shit-stirring moment, at which, very tragically, one protester was killed, called Blair Peach, who was killed by the police. I'm going to start with Steve, as I say, who's going to read about and talk about Cable Street. Please put your hands together for Steve Chambers.
I'll just say a couple of words about the Battle of Cable Street. Happened on the 4th of October 1936. Mosley's Black Shirts announced 4 days before, that they were planning to march through the East End. And the battle wasn't actually with the black shirts, it was with the police who were attempting to force a way through the East End. And my story basically begins on September the 30th and ends on October the 5th, the day after the battle. And it's formally, I suppose, it's a rite of passage. It features a young man called Sidney, who's an orphan. Sid was born in 1918. His parents were Jewish refugees from the Crimea, and they both died in the Great Flu pandemic at the end of the Great War. And Sid, the only thing Sid knows about his parents is that they were Jewish. Their papers were lost in the chaos, and he's called Sidney Smith. And he spends his life to the point before the battle in a series of orphanages and then a reformatory. He's a hothead. He has a bad temper. He'll fight with anyone, although he's not very big. And at the age of 15, he was given 5 shillings and put on a bus to Leeds. And he hitchhiked down to London. And for the 2 years since then, he's lived rough, making out by doing odd jobs, loading barrels in pubs and collecting cigarette ends and rolling up and selling them. And he's gravitated to the East End because there's a large Jewish community. And before the story begins, Sid is beaten up by the police very badly. Some black shirts were throwing bricks through a window in a Jewish tailor's shop in Aldgate, and the police were watching, and Sid had a go at them about why they weren't helping, and he got beaten up. And a young communist, a young Jewish communist called Wally and his family, who live in Cable Street, look after him. And while Sid's recovering, Wally attempts to educate him. And Sid's impressed by his dedication, but not very interested in communist theory, because all he wants to do is bash coppers and bash people. And basically, the Communist Party are worried about him because he's a hothead and they don't know what to do. And when the black shirts announced their march, a rally for Spain has been organised in Trafalgar Square by the Communist Party to support the Republican government because of Franco's attempt to overthrow them. And 2 women from Barcelona have arrived, Maria, who's young and vivacious and Spanish, and Gabriela, who's older, more serious and chain-smoking, who's Italian. And because the rally is not going ahead, they have to look after them to make sure Special Branch don't get hold of them before they can go back the following week. So Sid is given the job of looking after them, a job he does not want to do. So this section of the story, which I'm going to read, is Friday, the 2nd of October. And the story is called Little Bird. Sid spent the afternoon on London buses showing Gabriela and Maria the sights of London, while Wally took part in a previously planned anti-fascist march from Tower Hill. Wally had given Sidney enough money for bus fares, with a little extra just in case. Maria was excited at the sight of St Paul's and the Tower of London. Gabriela smoked constantly, occasionally shaking her head, but otherwise apparently indifferent. Sid struggled to contain his frustration and said little. Afterwards, as they walked back towards the East End, they passed a bookshop at the end of Royal Mint Street. Maria pointed at a book cover in the window and said something in Spanish. Gabriela snapped back at Maria, and the 2 women began a heated argument. At first, Sidney was intrigued as to what they were arguing about, but as the dispute showed no sign of diminishing, he became alarmed. People were beginning to stare. If a copper happened by, or someone alerted the police, they could be arrested. He told them to be quiet, but they just ignored him. The sound of a distant police whistle forced him to act. He clamped his hands over their mouths to shut them up. Then he pushed them into the lounge bar of the King's Arms across the road and sat them in a gloomy corner beneath a poster advertising the benefit of milk. "Sit still, smile and speak English if you don't want to be arrested," he ordered before heading to the bar. Although underage, Sydney had helped unload beer barrels and was on nodding terms with the barman. He wanted to order spirits, but 3 Buchanans would have cleaned him out. In the end, he ordered 3 halves of mild, but even the 1 and 2pence they cost took all the money Wally had given him, plus some of his own. Someone was playing "I'm in the Mood for Love" on a piano in the bar, accompanied half-heartedly by a few brave souls. It was still early. Sydney took the drinks over to Maria and Gabriella and told them to drink. Outside, the sound of running feet and another police whistle could be heard. Sydney shook his head and sipped his drink. Gabriella and Maria did the same, although Maria grimaced at the taste. "So what were you two fighting about?" "The traitor, Kamenev," Maria said quietly as Gabriella shook her head. "There was a book about him in the window of the bookshop. Gabriella thinks he is innocent." Earlier that summer, Lev Kamenev had been found guilty of conspiring with a foreign power to overthrow the Soviet Union and executed shortly afterwards. The trial had been in all the newspapers, and everyone in the local party had discussed it at length. Sydney hadn't been that interested, but it was big news because Kamenev had been on the first Central Committee with Lenin, Trotsky and Stalin. "But he confessed?" Sydney asked, puzzled. Maria nodded vigorously. "Exactly. Why would he do that if he was innocent?" "For the good of the party and Comrade Stalin," Gabriella said dryly. Maria raised her eyebrows. Outside, the commotion seemed to be dying down. Sid changed the subject. "Gabriella, when we were driving round on the bus," she peered at him through her spectacles, "why did you keep shaking your head?" "I was thinking how many fine buildings to be bombed," she said in her Italian accent. "Bombed? From the air? That's what happened in Spain. Your civil war." "It will be everyone's war soon," Gabriella said. "Tell me about it," Sydney asked. "Franco and the army have rebelled against the elected government. Franco is a fascist. Hitler and Mussolini are helping him, while the so-called democracies do nothing," Maria explained. "So you've come here to raise money for your side?" "Not just money. We need volunteers," Gabriella said. "To fight?" "See, our struggle is yours. If we don't defeat fascism in Spain, it will spread." "I'll go," Sid said out of the blue. Maria grinned, but Sydney was serious. "I'd like to fight." Gabriella lit another cigarette and blew the smoke upwards. "How old are you, Sydney?" "I'm 18. On Sunday." "What do you want? Why do you want to go to Spain?" she asked. "To fight the fascists." "You want to be hero?" "No. Yeah, I don't know." Sydney felt himself reddening. Gabriella leaned in close to him, and he could smell the garlic on her breath. "It's not adventure. It's war. People are fighting and dying. You can be wounded, killed." "I know that," he blustered. "Why now?" "Because you're here, asking for help. I've seen the black shirts strutting about. I've been bashed up by the police. I'm a communist and I want to fight." "You speak Espanol?" "No." "You have military experience?" "No." "Allora, what can you do?" Gabriella asked softly. "I don't know. I'm strong. I'm a good fighter. I don't give in." For the first time since he'd met her, Gabriella smiled. It transformed her face, and he glimpsed the youth and joy that had been there once. "What's funny?" he demanded. "Uccellino," she whispered. "You two what?" Sydney asked, feeling foolish. "Uccellino, little bird." Gabriella smiled. "I don't get it, Sydney." Sydney felt his anger growing. "You're not ready," Gabriella replied. "You have not learnt yet." "Learnt what?" "You'll know when it happens." Their glasses were empty and Sydney had no more money. "We should get going," he said, standing. The women nodded. Maria excused herself and went to the lavatory. Gabriella watched her go and frowned. "Why do they give me this girl? She does not listen." Sydney was troubled over the ferocity of the argument between the women. "How can you be certain about Kamenev?" Gabriella lit another one of her cigarettes and looked at him. "I know him in 1917. He never betrayed the revolution." Sydney thought about this. Gabriella touched his arm tenderly. "Be careful." "What?" "There are spies everywhere. Sometimes you must listen to your heart."
Thank you, Steve. Now we're going to go forward 22 years to the west side of London. Please put your hands together for Karline Smith.
So the section I'm going to read from my short story, The Whistling Bird, is the crux of the story. So after 2 days of attacks by white youths, the local West Indian Notting Hill community in 1958 gathered for a meeting at a resident's house. This is Alfonso, on Bramley Road, to discuss events. Alfonso has 3 daughters and he's concerned for them. It soon becomes clear the 2 days of unprovoked attacks are the last straw, and the community had to do something to defend itself. The house was so full. People spilled out of the downstairs rooms into the hall and the stairway heading to the first floor where the girls' bedrooms were. The air was stale with cigarette smoke. Even the open windows, allowing a fresh breeze from the road outside, couldn't disperse the smell. Alfonso had opened the front room, the best room, and as many people as could squeezed themselves onto the sofa and chairs. The rest stood. By immigrant standards, Alfonso Weatherburn was quite well off. Back home, he had been a lawyer working in Savannah-la-Moor, so wealth was not unknown to him. His family were descendants of plantation owners, and their European ancestry was evident in Pansy's fair complexion and green eyes. The kink in her hair gave away the African bloodline, and she often pressed it straight with a hot comb. Alfonso had come to the mother country because he believed it was his right. He was its heir, and no one could or would tell him otherwise. His arrival in 48, however, taught him he was just another black man, and there was no work for him as a lawyer. Reluctantly, he learned to drive London's trains, begrudging white lawyers and other professionals boarding his train to their offices in the city. That was a long time ago. Now he accepted his destiny. He couldn't go back. Notting Hill was his community, and here he was known as the loansman because he lent money at a reasonable rate to fellow countrymen shunned by banks. The extra income allowed him to purchase, decorate, and furnish the 3-story house where around 30 people, men, women, and some children, now assembled. He was glad the girls were out, Pansy at the library, and the others with friends 2 streets over. Celeste Brown, a teacher from Spanish Town, and her husband Patterson had called the meeting after 2 nights of rampaging by the Teddy Boys, following the attack on Raymond and his Swedish wife Madge outside Latimer Road Station. Tea and coffee were available for those who wanted refreshments, and some of the women brought pots of cooked rice and peas with chicken or curried mutton. They mashed up the restaurant last night, the Teddy Boy them, Celeste began with a tremor in her voice. When the police come from Harrow Road after we call them, I never hear such dirty language in my life. And you know what they did? They raid the shop for offensive weapons, take the machete we used to chop the meat, and shut down the shop. Now we scared the Teddy Boy go and come back and burn the shop down just like the house on Latimer Road. It's all we have. Me and Patterson put all we life savings in it. Why? If me didn't know me was coming here to this, me would never step foot in this God-forsaken place. Don't talk like that, Celeste, a young Trinidadian woman called Sarita said. God see the afflicted, and he shall deliver us. Cousin, did you tell the Caribbean Welfare Service? There was a buzz in the room, a hum of discontented voices in unison. Celeste kissed through her teeth harshly. The Caribbean Welfare Service is what can they do? We've been telling the police long time and they are not listening and they don't care. Instead of picking up these filth, the teddy boy them, they're standing back and watching. It's like they don't care. Look what happened to Gilly. I think we should fight back, Patterson said, tilting his trilby over his dark face, glistening with perspiration. This is a war now. Trusted by so many in the community, Alfonso felt people were waiting for him to speak. No need for that, he said, raising his hand. I've been advising people to get out early, do what they need to do, shopping, work, whatever, and come into their homes and lock up the doors early till it passes over. Suddenly, Alfonso thought about Pansy. Why should we hide like cowards? Hissing, teeth-kissing, and growl-like noises rose from the guests. Not a day goes by when the police don't pick up black people just for walking in the street. Nobody cares. Nobody doing nothing. Celeste brought her fist down on the arm of the chair with each word. I hear some of them white people making a plan for us next. Then Brixton. I hear there's going to be big trouble like Nottingham. Look at this leaflet they pushed through the door. Celeste handed a leaflet to Alfonso. He knew what it was without looking at it. A leaflet from those fascists, Oswald Mosley's union movement, spouting its usual garbage. He screwed the paper up and threw it on the low table in front of him. Nobody should panic, he continued, keeping his voice as calm as he could. This storm will ride over. Everything will be... Alfonso heard a smash. From the corner of his eye, he saw the object hurtle into the room, heard the whip of it through the air, and felt its breeze as it flew past his ear, landing on the table, sending the cups and plates flying, before crashing to the lino. The screams and shouts that followed almost deafened him. Bodies surged and crushed. Before he could catch his breath, he clambered to see what had caused the commotion. A large stone lay on the floor in the corner. Broken glass lay sprinkled over most of the guests. Still think we shouldn't fight back? Patterson asked, mouth twisted in a scowl, fists clenched into balls of anger. I think it's about time we give these people a good rassing.
Thank you, Karline. And now we're moving 21 years into the future to 1979, and a couple of miles further east into East London and Southal. Please put your hands together for Irfan Master.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out. This is a good turnout. Usually when I'm doing a reading, there's a lone man who wanders in and asks if there's free food. And when he finds out there's none, he usually leaves. So good on you for sticking around. I'm going to read about Southal and Blair Peach. On the evening of 23rd April 1979, more than 2,800 police officers, 94 of them on horseback, confronted an anti-fascist protest outside Southal Town Hall. In order to protect a meeting taking place within that building for a National Front election candidate, by the end of the night, 700 protesters had been arrested, of whom 340 were charged, mostly with public order offences. 64 people were receiving treatment for injuries at the hands of police officers, including several with head wounds. and one anti-fascist demonstrator, a New Zealand-born schoolteacher, Blair Peach, was dead. Why this story? When I received the list from Ra, when I saw Southal was the closest community to where I was born. I was born in Leicester, and I grew up in Leicester, and sort of I identified with what had gone on there and some of the National Front sort of provocations. And when I read about Blair Peach, I just felt very strongly that I had to write something to give him some testimony. It's the hardest story I think I've ever wrote, which Ra will testify for, because I think he got the story about a week before it went to print. Didn't it, Ra? It was pretty bad. Apologies, Ra, for that. I really struggled just because I'd never really written about a real person, a public figure before. And I just felt that he never really received testimony for 30 years or justice. And every time I sat down to write it, I struggled, and I felt like it wasn't quite right, it wasn't good enough, it didn't give him enough. And by the end, I kind of hoped I had, and it may never do, but I'm proud of it. So it's a story about a young boy wandering through on the day of 1979, on the day when the NF are sort of gathering, and there's a sort of a riot protest happening, and the police sort of kick off and start charging everybody, and violence ensues. The story is called Interstate. Dawn. The street lamps in Southal flicker, then flash, then die, as dawn unravels, solemn, silent. And silence makes the most of this moment, stretching its arms, enveloping the streets, and for the briefest of moments, Southal is safe. A catch of breath before the first pan is scraped on the stove, the first eggs cracked, the first cry of a hungry child, the first embrace of husband and wife, the first song heard on the radio. Tired streets, old roads, weary avenues, waking to lorries lumbering slow on Dominion Road, to 1,000 voices speaking in tongues foreign and fantastic. A sudden crash, milk bottles, scuttles the silence away. The broken glass, the spilt milk, the shock of sound brings a violence to the day that is unexpected. The light, when it comes, is mottled and reluctant to offer its true nature. A woman, sari-bound, shuffles across the pavement, stopping at each shop front to whisper a prayer of protection, willing the glass to hold. The unwilling light follows in her wake, painting its own picture, settling on roofs, a safe distance from what is to come. In a low-ceiling factory, a man flicks on a switch and a loom kicks up, the shuttle relaying too quickly until the thread snaps. The man swears, shutting the loom down, and starts the long process of removing broken threads. And here we come to rest. A woman with tired eyes gently guiding her son along the street, coaxing him to keep up, whispering to him to be careful in the world the light and silence has created. As dawn hastily leaves to settle on some other place less heavy with portent, the people wake, unaware of the battle between light and dark, sound and silence. Southal wakes. Dominion Theatre, 12th June 1979. Manjeet stood in line patiently, moving forward one short step at a time. The long line wound its way out of the theatre and spilled onto Dominion Road. A hum of prayer settled on the gathering, and lulled by the low cadence, Manjeet swayed with the crowd. Looking over his shoulder, he saw specks of saffron, white and yellow leading all the way down the road. The turbans flickered, small flames blaring against a grey sky. He touched his own turban and grimaced. His mother had laid it out on his bed that morning, starched and ready to wear. Folding the stiff material in his hands, it had taken him 3 attempts to tie it. It seemed to weigh heavier than he remembered. He was just reaching the threshold of the Dominion Theatre when he hesitated. What was he doing there? What was it he wanted to say or do? He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see an elderly man smile at him. He was wearing a white turban, and the absence of colour in the crisp, unbleached material startled Manjeet, made him self-conscious of his deep saffron, the colour of blood. The old man, sharp, alert, noticed. I am past colour, my child. White is easier for an old man like me. I was angry too, once. Rebellious, wanting to burn bright. Now I don't mind glowing dimly. Saffron doesn't feel right today. It's too rich, said Manjeet, shaking his head, embarrassed. Maybe that's precisely why it's right. Why are you standing here? Why am I, for that matter? Manjeet replied, turning to leave. To pay our respects, the old man intoned. It's important. He's dead. He can't hear our respects. Why else? Asked Manjeet, taking a step over the threshold. To bear witness, said the old man, putting a gentle arm around Manjeet. I'm struggling to bear it, said Manjeet, looking at his feet, unable to look at the photograph of Blair that was in the foyer. Courage, we must bear it. I walked past him. He was alive. He was smiling, and then everything happened, said Manjeet, touching his turban, reliving the moment. Gently shepherding Manjeet over the threshold, the old man nodded. Tell me, what happened? Manjeet walked along the Broadway, carrier bag in one hand, tall, trousers already too small, ankles exposed. Stick to the back streets, his brother Rana had said. Stay away from the town hall. Don't get involved. Run if you see a blue uniform. All right for him to say. Manjeet knew where his brother would be, in the thick of it, giving those fascists hell. Loud, angry, strong. Why couldn't Manjeet be a part of it? Southal, born and bred, he'd barely left the borough in his 14 years. Rana had always kept him away from any aggro. He'd never seen those fascists up close. He wanted to see what the fuss was about. He was miles away from the action. Taking a left onto Norwood Road, Manjeet walked toward the high street. It felt different. The air, the colour of everything. He noticed that he was gripping the carrier bag too tight and took a breath to release some tension. A fluttering flash of blue and red caught his eye and made him stop. On top of the council building was the Union Jack, St. George's Day. The flag looked pristine, the colours insultingly bright. As Manjeet had stopped, so did others, and each one noticed the flag, a splinter lodged in the translucent of the sky. It was noon, and already there were vans everywhere, full of police, waiting. There were people everywhere too, people from everywhere. What did these people care about Southall? Why had they come all this way to a world that wasn't their own? As he started getting closer to the town hall, the crowd swelled. There were police in large numbers lining the road. A dark wall of grim faces, tense bodies. Already small groups of elders were trying to talk to senior members of the police, whilst the younger ones were waiting, standing off, bristling. Manjeet moved closer to the growing crowds and searched the faces for Rana. He knew his brother would be annoyed with him for coming so close to the action, but Manjeet felt compelled to see, to understand why a group of people who hated him and his people wanted to hold a meeting here in Southall. He couldn't spot Rana and stepped back from the street, and that's when Manjeet sensed it, a feeling of dread. The air close, stifling, still. Southall was holding his breath. Manjeet's palms felt clammy, and he switched the carrier bag to his other hand, swearing under his breath, annoyed at his mother for asking him to go to the shop on this day of all days. His eyes blurred. The blue, the dark ominous block of colour the police wore seemed to multiply and to organise itself into lines and grids, creating around itself a negative space. No man's land. An invitation in the form of a blue wall for the bustling crowd to try and scale. Some of the elders were stepping back from the front line. Something in the way they moved suggested they had seen this before. Their old bones remembered. Some others held up their arms, trying to reason with the officers in charge. Manjeet couldn't read lips, but he could read two opposing views. He could read the anger in the crowd, as those elders still at the front pleaded with the officers to call the meeting off. And he could read the stubbornness, the set of the jaw of the officer in charge. Manjeet's ears began to close off the world around him and only pick up the sound of his own heart, a fist thumping against his chest from the inside. He looked across at the lines of young Asian men and saw fury. This would not stand, their clenched fists said. Even the elders who were trying to mediate shook their heads, resigned, knowing that this community had reached its limit. Manjeet saw the crowd ripple as if a long fuse had been lit from a distance. Behind the police, in the space they had created around the entrance to the town hall, a small handful of men and women appeared. They raised their fists at the crowd, smiling in their direction. A couple lifting their arms in the short, sharp motions, aping the Nazi salute. This was it? This small gathering, less than 100. Manjeet noted the smug faces, swaggering, self-assured and totally safe. They looked so ordinary. On the walk here, Manjeet had made monsters of these men. Contorted faces, tall as trees, wild eyes, barbed skin, clawed hands. But these were men he saw on the streets every day. Ordinary, men he saw driving buses, selling fruit, councilmen, teachers at his school, police. And this, more than anything, filled Manjeet with fear. Monsters he could spot a mile off and avoid. But ordinary people living alongside him, walking down the streets, going about their lives. And all the while with this inside them, this rage and anger towards him, his family, his people. Manjeet stepped back from the fray. The realization filled him with so much panic, it made him stagger. As the members of the National Front walked into the town hall, he felt a wave of frustration crash forwards from the front line, exploding against the shield wall. The police lines broke and charged the protesters where they stood. Batons and shields raised, the blue bloc surged against a massed crowd. Manjeet heard the sharp clap of hooves and concrete, and out of the confusion and mass of bodies trying to get away, horses charged, and on them men with heavy truncheons. For a moment, Manjeet stood and observed the chaos objectively. He was not really there. None of them were. Manjeet didn't move an inch. Like a pebble on an ocean bed, he felt the force of water sweep over him. Through a break in the crowd, he glimpsed a woman dressed in a white shalwar kameez sitting on the floor, refusing to move. An older boy hurtled past him and grabbed Manjeet by the collar, dragging him along. He was propelled from his reverie into a sprint, heading for an alleyway. Manjeet looked back for the woman in white, but she was gone. The older boy looked over at Manjeet as he ran and shook his head. "What's wrong with you standing there like that? I didn't think they were after me." "It doesn't matter, does it? You're in the way. You've got a big red turban on your head, like baiting a bull. You know they can't see anything else." "Where are we going?" "Away from the action. The SPG are on the prowl," said the boy, shivering. "Who are the SPG?" "Special Patrol Group. You'll know them when you see them. Big bastards. They kick first, ask questions later. If you see one, don't hang around like back there. They're not interested in having a chat. Find a safe spot and stay there until things calm down. One thing we got over them is we know these back streets. Home advantage, isn't it?" "Doesn't feel much like home today," said Manjeet, doing his best to keep up. The boy looked at him properly, slowing his pace. The high street was far behind them now. As they picked their way through residential back streets, Manjeet walked past houses, seeing anxious faces in windows. "Are you Rana's kid brother?" "Yeah, Manjeet." Chuckling to himself and pulling Manjeet with him, he said, "He's going to kill you, man. Not if the police get me first." Thank you.
I was going to start with just by asking why did you pick this particular story? Irfan, you talked a little bit about how it kind of connected to you in terms of your community in Leicester, but starting with you, you've also had your fair share of experience of the police as well. So do you want to talk a little bit more about?
Yeah. Growing up in Leicester, it was a regular occurrence with the skinheads. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. It was a regular occurrence. My first visit to London was I hitchhiked with my friend Stephen to London for the New Year's Eve sort of celebrations, to see the sort of fireworks and Trafalgar Square and all that kind of stuff. And we were hanging around the back of Charing Cross Road, and we were exhausted, and we didn't have much money between us, maybe enough for a sandwich between us. And we were thinking, oh, how the hell are we going to get back to Leicester? One, because we'd hitchhiked all the way there in those days, hitchhiking and all that. And two, we're just thinking, so don't know anybody, what we're going to do, when's it going to kick off here, we're waiting for the celebrations to start. And this black van pulls up, and it's sort of blacked out, and about 4 or 5 quite tall men, they're all 6 foot, over 6 foot in those days, and come out and say, "Oh, you two, what are you doing? Are you loitering here? What are you?" And they pointed to the shop that we were leaning against, and the shop was like a bridal gown shop. And they said, "Oh, you lot, do you want to rob this shop?" We said, "It's a bridal gown shop." Like, what do you think we're going to do on New Year's Eve robbing a bridal gown shop? We're going to steal the bridal gown and run up Charing Cross Road. And they didn't like our cheeky back chat, really. And Stephen sort of said, look, we're just tired, we're just sort of hanging around. And the lead guy just hit him over the head and cracked his head open, and he started bleeding, and they dragged him into the black van and threw him and started beating the crap out of him. And then so I said, come on, look, he hasn't done anything. I got my hand up, and he grabbed my hand and threw me in. But luckily, having been in these situations before, I knew how to go hedgehog quick. And so I didn't get as much of a beating as Stephen, but Stephen got the worst of it. And so my first evening in London, the great city of London, was spent at Charing Cross Hospital, getting Stephen stitched up, which we walked up the road and we got him stitched up. And although they weren't special patrol group at that time, I think they were probably just a version of them, you know, kind of loitering around. So, yeah, that was great. Fun times. I went back to London after that as well a few times and studied there, but yeah, that was my first ever.
Welcome to London. Karline, what was it about this particular story that kind of grabbed you? And I should say, each of the writers kind of met with a historian or worked with a historian. So yeah, tell us about what drew you to the story.
I think I was drawn to the story mainly because my dad used to tell me stories about the Teddy Boys and how they had to form gangs to defend themselves. My dad's passed away now, so I couldn't really sort of like, you know, draw on his experiences. But he always said they were fearful. This is living in Longsight. There used to be a billiard centre, and the Teddy Boys used to gather around there, so he said he was terrified. So with that in mind, I think the story came to me, and I thought, I have to write it. I must say it was quite challenging, especially doing the research, because I wanted it to be quite accurate, but yet at the same time I wanted the story to flow. So yeah, it was quite challenging, and just drew me.
And Steve, why Cable Street? I mean, it's pretty iconic to those people who know about it, but it's not that well known.
No, that's a surprise, actually. Every time people have asked me, what are you writing at the Battle of Cable Street? They go, what? The man who published my novel is called Martin Ellis, and he published a memoir of an international brigade, Spanish International Brigade survivor, which I ended up adapting for the BBC World Service. I was recording something, and I remember the producer looked at me and said, have you got anything else? And I went, and I was reading this book at the time. I said, well, I'm reading about the International Brigades, this survivor, and he was from London. He was called George Wheeler, and he volunteered towards the end of the Spanish Civil War. But what I didn't know was that Martin's grandfather was a famous brigade commander who was executed by the fascists. And because I ended up adapting this, for the one and only time in my career, I was taken to Spain by the BBC, and we went to a battlefield and we interviewed survivors, both on the right and the left. And the story stayed with me. So when I saw the list of subjects, I mean, the one that leapt out at me was the Battle of Cable Street, because I knew it was contemporary with that kind of arena, and I knew something about it because a long time ago I did a lot of community theatre, and there's a famous play by Dave Holman called No Passaram, which is about the Battle of Cable Street. And it's interesting that history largely seems to have disappeared in the last 25 years. So I was drawn to it for that reason, and that's why I was interested in linking it to other events that were going on in the world, rather as they are now. You know, we have a problem here, but it's clear that the right is on the rise in Europe and in America. Like you, I was slightly intimidated by writing about something real, and I went to talk to David Rosenberg, thank you. And we walked up and down Cable Street on one of the hottest days of the year. There isn't much of it left, but it was important, it seemed to me, to understand the geography of the area so I could understand what the black shirts were trying to do and why the battle happened where it did. And the most amazing thing that David had, was, apart from encyclopedic knowledge, was some photographs of the battle on the day. They're just so evocative. So I suppose that's what drew me to it. And then, I guess like all of us, you spend quite a long time thinking, how the hell am I going to do this? And
that was going to be my next question. How difficult was it to fictionalize something which is about real people and real lives, and in your case, Irfan, about a real tragedy, a real death?
It was really, really difficult because I'd obviously written a lot of stories, probably about my family members. Now that this is being filmed, that's probably a bit of a confession there. So, but I can change a few things. But with Blair, the reason I was caught in this sort of headlights a little bit was that he was a real person. I wanted to give him testimony because basically in 1979 he was killed, murdered by the SPG. They sort of knew who did it. It was a cover up. They hid it, and they didn't really, until 2010. They didn't really admit that they were at fault. So that's almost 30 years where he has no testimony, no justice, no witness. And so writing a story made me feel I have to give him something within these words. Even if I'm not directly writing about him, he has to be there, and this has to be sort of witness. So basically what I'm saying is I find it very difficult to be objective about the police, and write in a way which is like, it was a balanced view, it was great. The police didn't do anything wrong, they were just there, or I found it very difficult to sort of come down on that side and, call me whatever you want, if you're maybe a wishy-washy liberal or whatever, socialist nonsense, but that's me.
Thanks. Karline, you worked with Dr. Kenny Munrose, who is a historian of that sort of era, and the interesting thing about Notting Hill now is it's famous for the carnival, but very few people know that the carnival was actually something which grew out of the Notting Hill Riots. There was an American socialist or communist who was kicked out of America because of McCarthyism, called Claudia Jones, who was trying to raise money for some of the men that were arrested in '58. And the very, very first kind of Notting Hill Carnival event, which I think was Lambeth Hall or another one of those. It was a concert hall. It was indoors. Was partly to raise money to pay for their legal fees. And now we all know Notting Hill Carnival is like famous around the world, but people don't know that the Notting Hill Carnival came out of a riot which was to defend the community from Telly Boys and fascists. And your story is also dedicated to a particular character who dies. Do you want to talk a little bit about Kenzo Cochrane?
Yeah, when I was doing my research, before I spoke to Dr. Kenny, I went on the internet, so I kind of went on YouTube and I started watching lots of videos, based around that time, and then I came across the story of Kelso, who had been stabbed and murdered by 3 white youths a year after the Notting Hill Riots, and I was actually moved by it. I think for me, researching it was quite hard. It was quite hard. It was hard to sort of like put myself away from the events. It was quite tearful, but I also thought to myself, surely it couldn't have been all that depressing. And I read a couple of stories. I started to read this novel by, I forgot the author's name, but it's called The Lonely Londoners. And what I saw was a completely different London. I saw people mixing together, getting on quite well. So one of the things I wanted to put in that story was that it wasn't just all doom and gloom. There were, a mixture of people black and white people living together in harmony. And so I put in a sort of love story, which probably wouldn't have gone down too well at that time, in the story, just to lift it a little bit, but still, base it on the Notting Hill Riots. So for me, it was quite painful and emotional, and I thought about my parents, and my dad came in here in 1958. I thought, did he endure this? What they had to go through, poor housing, but what came across for me very strongly was the unity that people had back then. The way that they gathered together, and how they supported each other. So yeah,
I think that's a really strong thread in all three of the stories, really.
Yeah.
There's so many aspects of this issue we can talk about. It should be. I should point out that there is a kind of a bit of a bright side to Karline's story, the 58, and the death of Southal Cochrane, in that when Southal Cochrane was murdered a few months after, the sort of early 1959, and Oswald Mosley, the leader of the Black Shirts, who had a party in the 30s called the British Union of Fascists, was then tried for treason, spent a bit of time in jail, came back. That wasn't the end of his political career. He came back and set up the Union movement and tried to get re-elected as an MP in Kensington, which was the constituency in which, in Notting Hill constituency. And in 59, there was a chance that he was going to get back in as another fascist member of parliament. But the death of Southal Cochrane and protests around that, plus the riots of 58, caused a turn in public opinion, and he only got less than 3,000 votes in that constituency election of 59. So that was a happy story. Sadly, in 79. Blair Peach's death came shortly after, it was around the time that Thatcher's rhetoric of us being swamped, people being swamped, etc., sort of xenophobic rhetoric was very, very much, currency at the time, and it happened a week before the general election. And it's almost like we're in deja vu. When I read that story and I learnt about that story, it's like we're in Groundhog Day, because the death of Joe Cox was exactly the same in 2016, a few days, like a week before, less than a week before the referendum election, and it had absolutely no effect. And Blair Peach's death had absolutely no effect, and people were still quoting Thatcher on the way to the ballot box in 79, saying people are worried about being swamped, etc., etc. And Joe Cox's death had absolutely no effect on the election. So although the 59 story has some positives, the 79 story and the 2016 story is utterly depressing. And the line which kind of haunts me from your story, Steve, was this line of, I think Maria says, soon it'll be everyone's war. My question is how worried and how terrified and how depressed are you right now, to each of you? Because we do find ourselves in. If you look at the dates, it's 21 years. It's a cycle. It just keeps coming back, and the same factors, the same kind of. There's a lot of spin and new technology involved in kind of media perpetuation of racism and xenophobia, but it's still the same thing. So yeah, how terrified / depressed are you?
Just to say, the Battle of Cable Street was a victory. Mosley wanted to march through the East End. They stopped him at Gardener's Corner, and they forced the police down Lehman Street, and they stopped them in Cable Street. Lots of arrests, lots of violence, but they stopped them. The Home Secretary told Mosley he would not be able to have his march. And Mosley agreed, because he flew to Germany on the Monday and married Unity Mitford, in Goebbels' house secretly, which obviously kept secret from the British public. Yes, I think we do live in scary times, but Graham Swift says in Waterland, I quote this, he said, every generation has to re-dredged the channel, and I think we have to rediscover the meaning of the things that we take for granted. And the only way we can do that is when we're threatened with losing them. And it's not an optimistic thing, but I just think, well, it's coming round again and we have to fight again. But I think it seems to me that a lot of people do seem to be being politicized at the moment, which is encouraging. But, you know, of course it's scary. It's horrifying to be in a world where phrases and attitudes that were once thought to be appalling are now kind of voiced by public figures on a fairly daily basis.
For me, I think that with the rise of social media, you become aware of it all the time. It's, you know, it's on the news, it's on the internet. Every time you open some sort of medium, it's there, it's everywhere. And for me, the way that I deal with it is just I have to shut down from it. I have to close my eyes and just take myself away from it. It is quite frightening, because if you take it all in, it's quite frightening. You know, it is quite frightening. You're just wondering if there ever will be a change.
Yeah, pretty depressing from time to time. I mean, you know, it's not America, right? It's not Brazil, right? It's not Turkey, right? We can still organize here. I walk the streets. I work with a lot of young people, do a lot of mentoring projects in Islington. They're willing to organize, you know. They get together. It might seem like they're not interested, but they are. There's always hope, you know, borough to borough. We've got the tools here and the resources. We've got the history here. We've got people saying this is what happened. We can't let it happen again. So it's depressing, but you know, young people, I think they'll get together. You know, I mean, you've got a lot of high-profile people in music and fashion and people talking about it, which never used to happen. And they'll go out and say, you know, whatever, Theresa May's an idiot, or whatever, in words to this effect. So I'm hopeful, you know, because what else is there to be? You can't be depressed, you know. I talk to young people all the time, and you know, you can have a conversation that's about, you know, Rihanna, but you can also have a conversation about the politics of the world. You know, you have to balance it out. But I'm hopeful, you know, because we really didn't have access to any information, and we struggled to organize because of that. It was like Karline was saying, you know, there was community sort of well-being, and you know, I mean, someone ringing your landline saying, "Oh, we're going to meet at community centre at 6 o'clock, and make sure you're there." Now you can organize much quicker. So I'm hopeful, and yeah, you know, we just keep going.
Thanks. I'm sure people have got questions. There's plenty of opportunities. I can keep talking all night, but let's throw it out to the audience. There's a roving mic if anybody has any questions.
Questions, please. Who's going to be brave first?
Yeah, there's the woman there in the green, and then we'll come to you in the blue. Thanks. So there. Yeah.
Thank you for those. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you for those readings. They were wonderful. I wanted to ask you, Ra, about what motivated. But you said a lot about what motivated these two books. I just hoped that you could tell us more about the role of literature in this kind of amidst this kind of depressing, seemingly hopeless world that we seem to inhabit. And we tend to think that it's the worst yet. What is the role of telling stories, apart from just retelling history? What's the role of telling fictional stories? What's the role of literature in trying to inhabit this world that we have to inhabit?
Thanks. I think I'll probably throw this over to the others, but from my point of view, it was really important that these were fictions, because there is a sense that if you don't pay too much attention to history, if you're not a historian, you don't study it too much, you can probably come away thinking that, you know, progress is inevitable, and you know, the women would have got the vote eventually, and you know, fascism in Germany would have you know, faded out eventually, or you know, these the great sort of achievements of progress movements will somehow, you know, they would have happened if it wasn't this particular individual that, you know, made a sacrifice, etc., etc. And it's a really, really dangerous and lazy kind of point of view. And the idea with fiction is just to kind of put ourselves in the point of view of a character who doesn't see the future, doesn't know what their sacrifice, doesn't know what will happen, and is prepared to sacrifice or make sacrifices and risk their own lives if necessary for a particular cause. And it was important that it was fictional, because if we know the character historically beforehand, if it's a real historical figure, then we know what happens to them. So you need to engage, you know, you need to sort of engage with the drama and the risk, I think, to that extent. Obviously, telling stories is a complicated process, and I think story is both powerful and useful, but it's also dangerous. And I think we tell ourselves stories about history all the time, and we need to question them. You know, I talked about Thomas Carlyle and the great man theory, but it's everywhere. Nowadays we have it in kind of, I call it the Piers Morgan version of World War II. And he's been called out on it a few times, where, you know, Piers Morgan presents Churchill as basically winning the war single-handedly in an arm wrestle against Hitler, and nobody else was involved. It's kind of easy to simplify these stories, and our love of story and simple stories is sometimes the danger. So we need to have as many and as complicated stories as possible, and it's essential also that we had to kind of get the historians and the specialists and the eyewitnesses on board as well, because you know, they spend their lives researching this stuff, and in some cases they were there themselves. The consultants were there, or have been, you know, heavily involved in them. And in the case of Irfan's story, it was about somebody who passed away, and it turned out by pure coincidence I kind of knew his girlfriend. She works on a different project at Commodore, Refugee Tales. She's an activist and a volunteer of the Refugee Tales project, and so I needed to make sure that she was okay with this story. And I know Irfan was very, very nervous about me kind of sharing it with her, but fortunately she was very, very okay with it. So you have to kind of respect those people that were there and those people who have studied it. You can't just make it up out of thin air or whatever. But yeah, do you guys want to add anything?
Well, humans are storytelling animals. We tell stories to make sense of the chaos that otherwise exists for all of us. And I think the other thing is it's propaganda, and it's about time we had some propaganda on the left, because, you know, so much of what we receive is mediated through the prism of a particular point of view. The other thing is that we experience life emotionally, primarily, and so what fiction enables us to do is to feel the world as it was, rather than just observe it sort of like a diagram. And I think that's its great strength, because in my case anyway, it's an attempt to make it feel contemporary. And I think that's a really useful thing to do, so that you allow people access to the past, which is tricky, of course. Of course it's tricky, you know. You don't want to traduce anybody, and you don't want to tell lies, I guess. So it's a complicated thing to do, but I think one way or another, I've done quite a lot of it. I think it's quite an important thing to do, because I think it opens it up and makes it accessible to everyone, and not just experts.
Thanks.
Yeah, mine was just pure and simple. It was justice, and and testimony, as I mentioned before, for Blair, which made it very difficult to write about. I just wanted to give him some sort of, just be a witness to what happened to him, and his family and his girlfriend. And yeah, I was really nervous when you sent that on, and I got these words which were really, really beautiful and humble, that she thought that I did a good job with the story, and that mattered to me. That did, usually you write a story and it's out in the world and it doesn't matter, it's going to be what it's going to be, but this one really mattered, and that was different. So I was trying to find some justice, some truth. We're storytelling human beings. I'm quite a political person, but I do it through my writing. I will be on the protest, but I won't always be on the fore. I'm always watching and looking and seeing what I can write about, and opportunities. We Common Press do a lot of political writing, which is great because there's not loads of it in the world, and in this country, because it's always high risk. Only Ra's crazy enough to publish this stuff, because he's brave and courageous. He's done some really good stuff that a lot of people won't publish. So when you get asked to do something like this, it's great to be on board with so many other great writers as well. So truth, justice, and the American way.
Any other? There's a question down here.
What the power is you've all in your stories picked out some of these individuals. I don't know enough about Cable Street, but definitely what happened to Kelso Cochrane. That was an ongoing battle, particularly for the Caribbean community, for many, many years, and it's probably still going on in terms of justice. And there must have been a lot of research had to take place. So, for example, I know a little bit about Blair Peach, and I know that after the Southal Riots, that the British judiciary drew on the Northern Ireland magistrates the day after, who had no knowledge whatsoever of the Asian communities, and came in and handed down some very stiff sentences. So I'm wondering, when you do carry out research process, to what extent do you draw on these kind of the wider structural issues that exist in society? Because you don't want to be a diatribe, and I think it's bringing a bit of humanity to those pressures that are taking place.
For me, I read some of the court reports, which was ridiculous, because people witnessed Blair getting hit and falling, Sikh men. And so when they went to offer their testimony, they were told that they didn't know much about British culture, and their language facility wasn't quite strong enough for them to be credible witnesses, and they were eliminated as witnesses, even though they were on the spot, saw him being then dragged, and then he went into the house. So if you read some of those reports, it just, it's fairly ridiculous as to the process. It was a total cover-up. Now, when you say cover-up, people are like, oh no, come on, there's due process, and people, there's evidence of witness, and there's a proper, it goes to the proper sort of official channels. But it was a cover-up. Just like, I guess Hillsborough was a cover-up, So when you read this stuff, it makes you laugh, because you think, oh, I can't believe that this happened, but it did happen, and then you have to deal with that, and you have to say, okay, at the end of the day, and they didn't cover it for 3 years or 5 years. For 30 years. It's 2010 when they sort of admitted, yeah, this was a problem. Yeah, we know who sort of did it, but we can't really, it's classified, So you do the research. It helps a little bit to give you the tone of the language and the sort of solemnness of what you want to say. And also makes you just sort of think, oh, unbelievably, I can't believe this happened.
For those people that don't know the story of Blair Peach, there was a discovery of a stash of improvised weapons that the SPG were using, and they included kind of lead pipes that were wrapped in rubber that had been specially made to break the skull but not leave bruising. And it's just incredible.
So you die from internal bleeding, more or less. So you can't see the bruise, but essentially you're hemorrhaging inside, which is technically what happened to Blair in a way, because he was sort of okay for a bit, and then 5 hours later he was gone. So yeah, they found ways to,
Thanks a lot.
Afternoon.
Hi.
Right.
I've just got a question about, you know, you're talking about it's important to have literature out there that's political and that it's sort of like propaganda in a way for maybe a more sort of like left-leaning point of view. How do you ensure that that sort of point of view reaches more than just maybe the audience who agrees with you? Because isn't politics about change?
Yeah. Well, that's the hardest question of the day. Yeah, it's very, very difficult. It's the bubble question, isn't it? How do you get out of your Facebook bubble, your social media bubble, your friends bubble, your speaking to the choir? Yeah, it's really, really hard. You just have to keep pushing. All I can say is, you know, we're all ignorant and we're all learning constantly. I didn't know about Blair Peach until one of Commer's writers, Dinesh Aliraja, talked about it in his blog. And to me, it was like I was 8 when that happened, so my parents didn't talk about it. But when I asked my mum about it, it's like, yeah, everybody knows about Blair Peach. It's famous. So things are lost generationally, and my colleague, who's much younger than me, didn't know about Greenham Common. It's like, how do you not know about Greenham Common? And she's politically aware, and it's like she was really embarrassed the moment she Googled it. And so it's not just about people that we are not in contact with. It's also people, even on the left, who maybe don't know about aspects of this history. We have to continually talk to everybody, and I don't really have an answer to your question about how you get out of your bubble, but you can just keep making it, normalizing the conversation about it within your spheres, and maybe that conversation will bleed out into, you know, beyond your bubble. Maybe, I don't know. That's a rubbish.
Subscribe to Fox News updates every.
That's a rubbish answer. Sorry.
The problem's money. You know, the powerful media outlets have huge amounts of money behind them. You look at them, Rothermere and the Barclay twins and people like that, billionaires who are in favour of Brexit, live offshore. They're the people who have the power to disseminate this information. And obviously, in fighting back, we're a very small voice. And, you know, whenever you produce something, the big problem is marketing. You know, if it's obvious on one level, but it's such a big problem because you're not going to get, you know, occasionally I get the train, I see a billboard on the station platform for a book I've never heard of, and I think, bloody hell, they're on every, you know, who's paying for that? That's, it seems to me, what you're up against. I mean, wouldn't it be great if Ra's book was on, you know...
HarperCollins is owned by Murdoch.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, you said Fox.
I guess, you know, I've been on a platform with Tommy Robinson. And
how was that?
It was great, yeah, it was really good. I had a really... had a great chat with him. No, I asked him, because I was right near him, and he was with, you know, one other guy, and I had just say, look, Tommy, what is it about? You know what I mean? We're here, we're just talking. You know, what is it about? What drives you? You know, what makes you get up every day and think, oh, this is what I want to do with my life? And he was pretty civil. You know, there was nothing there. He said, this is what I believe. And I said, do you really believe it? Do you really believe it, or have you gone round the bend now? Of just sort of being someone else now, because that's not even you, that's not your name, that's not who you are, your identity is wrapped up in it. How do you, you know, go beyond it? And he said, yeah, he goes, look, this is just the sort of the stand I want to make, and just like you want to make your stand. And so I tried to get, you know, I'd have a conversation with anybody, you know, it doesn't matter. And I think that's the first step, it's the most important thing. Yeah, Facebook is an echo chamber of just, you know, you just get it back what you want to hear most of the time. But I am friends with a lot of people who are, you know, right of centre, and I always see what they're talking about or see what their comments are about, just to sort of keep an idea of what's happening in the world, the articles they're reading or whatever they're posting and stuff like that. Just because it gives me a bit more of a balanced view, you know. I'll probably skim read it, but you know, you do what you can, right? I mean, you know, but you've got to have that conversation. If you can't have that conversation across the table from someone who's polar opposite of your political viewpoint, then nothing is ever going to change. You can't make them see your humanity and vice versa. And that's all we're trying to do, step by step by step by. So I think it's sort of important. It's tough, but don't give up.
Thank you. One last question.
Hi. Fascinating stories this afternoon. Definitely been educated. But my question is, Karline, you mentioned a little bit about social media. And in the last 5 years, have we seen so much increase in young people with social media, but such a decline in current affairs and world issues? How we're going to motivate young people these days to see the positives and the optimism that we can use to promote good activism, and as Steve, you mentioned also about the constant cycle that we see over probable 20-year periods. So, and then maybe in 2038, for instance, we may be seeing a similar situation as we have in 2016. I just want to see how we can, I see I'm the youngest person in the room today. I don't see how we could change the mindsets of young to be more interested in what's happening today. Thanks.
Who wants that one? One thing I've noticed, my nephew is 21, lives in Manchester, is half Egyptian, should be really, 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 left wing, or should be on it when it comes to how biased Facebook is and how thoroughly disgusting Facebook is if you actually look at it. And he's not, and that's slightly worrying. Even if you're left wing, you will get right wing. I can show you them. I've taken. You'll get right wing adverts. You'll get right wing videos, and even if you delete all of your right wing friends, because I've done it, and I've also added, right wing friends or right wing people. You will always get those adverts, and they are absolutely appalling. It's like, how has this advert got on my phone, or how has this video got on my phone, and yeah, they'll just there's an old line from Howard Zinn again, who says you can't stand still on a moving train. So anybody that says, like, if Zuckerberg says, I'm just an advertiser, I'll just take advertising money from anybody, you're pretending to be neutral, but you're on a moving train which is biasing, these huge corporations or these billionaires who have got very good reasons for advertising on these platforms. So if you pretend to be neutral, you're not. You're moving with the train. And that's what Facebook does, and that's what all the social media do. They're moving with it, and they're perpetuating this filth. So I do worry about kids who are just on Snapchat and Facebook and Twitter or whatever all the time, because they don't realise what they're really cogs, the machine they're cogs in. And until we actually realise what the advertising model does, and just understand, it's pretty basic, but until they realise that, I'm worried.
Apathy amongst young people is difficult, because obviously they've got so much going on in terms of the screen in front of them. The young people in our family, when the political system, the people in power let you down again and again and again and again, it's very difficult to get up and say, yeah, I'm going to vote and make a difference, and make a change. And they have their phases. In my own family, you get young people who at 16 say, nah, screw it, I ain't voting, I don't give a shit, But then 10 years later now, they're a lot more interested. And at that time I judged them harshly and said, you're crazy, you got to vote. Are you mad? You have to vote. What are you talking about? You're not going to vote. That's ridiculous. Something's changed in the last 10 years. I don't know what it is exactly for them particularly, but they're a lot more vocal. They're more interested in the process. They keep up to date with things like that. I don't really know the answer to it, but I judged them harshly 10 years ago, which I shouldn't have. I should have just kept talking to them and saying, come on, just come with me. We'll go and vote together, that kind of thing. But instead, I said, "Oh, you lot, crap, mad. We're talking about if you don't vote, it's going to be terrible, because people really need to get out there, all that kind of stuff." So, I think phases, different things happen, for different people, and I think there's a lot more people out there in the public. Like I said, if major major cultural stars are out there making very political, overt statements, I think that really seems to regenerate the youth, and I think we'll always be there. You know what I mean? So, got to just stay hopeful. I think so.
Thank you. I think.
Can I say something, please?
Yes.
I want to say thank you to all three people. I have personal experience of all three. My husband was at the Battle of Cable Street. My 16-year-old grandson said to me last night, "What? I've come up in his estimation. Last week I was a boring old." I worked in Notting Hill, straight from university in Scotland, where there was signs, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Both my grandparents were from Ireland who came to work in Glasgow. I was involved in the Southal monitoring group, right? What we're experiencing, we must pass the baton, but this is what I would call end of empire, and a lot of the British people cannot accept that. That's the way I see the world, and I have experience of living in Africa, right? But we must keep going, because people have been through much harder times than we have. And so I have to say thanks. I thought, am I going to go to this again? And I'm glad I came. You've cheered me up.
We're glad you came as well. We're glad. Round of applause here, I think.